The Nintendo 3DS had a pretty well documented rough start to its life. There were eye strain concerns for the use of the 3D feature, it had a pretty high price point at launch, and it had just come off the back of the iconic Nintendo DS. And on top of this, the launch lineup of titles was, well, questionable. And that's what we're looking at today, the Nintendo 3DS launch titles, what made them good, what made them bad, and as to why they caused the 3DS to underperform. There are 18 games in this list in no particular order. The vast majority of the titles in this list are all the North American launch lineup, but there are a couple of others for alternate countries. So anyway, enough yapping about the intro, let's get on with the games. So our first game is Super Monkey Ball 3D. Super Monkey Ball 3D was published and developed by Sega. It released in March 3rd in Japan, but was a launch title everywhere else in the world for the 3DS. If you have not played Monkey Ball before, firstly, just go and play it. Secondly, let me just quickly explain the concept to you. You control the platform of a monkey that's in a ball, you roll the monkey around, collect bananas, and get to the end of the stage. And that is about as brief and accurate of a description I can give you about what Monkey Ball actually is. So Super Monkey Ball 3D has both a single player and multiplayer mode. The single player section has 3 different modes: regular Monkey Ball, Monkey Race, and Monkey Fight. Now the primary point of this game is to play actual Monkey Ball, so let's focus on that. The game has this cute storybook aesthetic in both its menu design and its levels, and it works pretty well. Each world starts with a cute, almost Paper Mario-esque cutscene, and it sets the tone really well. Once you get into the game, you have 2 different control schemes you can use. You can use the 3DS's circle pad to move the stage, or you can use the gyroscope on the console and tilt it instead. Now it's down to personal preference which of these you'll probably choose, but personally I would always choose the circle pad. It just allows for more precise controlling. To be honest, the best way to look at this entry in the Monkey Ball series is Baby's First Monkey Ball. It is incredibly easy. The first 2 games in the series that I played on the GameCube provided a lot of fun and a lot of frustration. Fair but challenging platforming, but this is just easy. There is nothing challenging in this game. A lot of the levels have too many guardrails to stop you from falling off, so it doesn't really make for much of a challenge. I suppose if you're someone who is particularly bad at Monkey Ball and you want to get into the series, then this is probably a good game for you, but for people like myself, who are fans of the franchise, this just isn't it. It's not a bad game, it looks charming, it plays well, it's just too easy, and lacking in content. This game was charged at full price, the full $40, and what you got just wasn't worth that price. In terms of critical response, Super Monkey Ball 3D holds a 55 out of 100 Metascore, which is actually lower than I thought it was going to be. Most of the reviews pretty much state, it's technically sound, it works, there's just nothing to do, and what is there is way too easy, so I'm not the only one of this opinion. The user score perfectly matches the critic score as well, with a 5.5 out of 10. It's quite rare to see a game that so perfectly balances on both critic and user score, so pretty much everyone universally shares the same opinion on this game. It's fine, it's just too easy. So with that, let's move on to our next game. Okay, so next up we have our first-party Nintendo release for the 3DS in this video, and that is Pilotwings Resort. This was developed by Monster Games and published by Nintendo. It was a launch title here in Europe and in North America, but in Japan it did not release until April of 2011, just a couple of months into the 3DS's lifespan there. So Pilotwings Resort sees you return to the iconic Woohoo Island, most famously used in Wii Sports Resort, although it did first appear in Wii Fit, creatively titled Wii Fit Island. Now this is the 3rd and most recent entry in the Pilotwings series, and both previous games in the series have also acted as launch titles for their respective consoles, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and the Nintendo 64. Perhaps we'll see a Pilotwings come out on Switch too, who knows. Pilotwings Resort consists of 2 different gameplay modes. You have Mission Mode and a Free Roam. The Mission Mode has a variety of different tasks for you revolving around the 3 main modes of transport in the game: the plane, the jetpack, and the glider. There were also 3 super vehicle variations of these, including a turbojet, a super rocket belt, and the pedal glider, which you unlock later on into the game. These missions will have you doing things such as flying through balloons, jetpacking through rings, gliding and landing safely on a target, so on and so forth. These missions are fine, they're pretty cool, but they didn't hold my attention for too long. There's a small bit of replay value in these missions, so you can try and aim to get the highest score possible, but outside of this, once you've done a mission, there isn't really much point in going back to it. Which brings us along nicely to the free roam mode, where you can fly about, find collectibles, balloons, stunt rings, and trivia about the island. But this has one enormous catch. It's on a time limit. I don't know whose incredible idea it was to make a free roam mode of Woohoo Island and have it on a time limit, but whoever they are, I hope they're having a bad day. Just kidding. But in all seriousness, it's a really bad idea and really affects the overall quality of the game. It's such a minor thing that they should have just not bothered doing. Now, this was actually the first game for the 3DS to feature Mii characters, which is pretty cool. And I have to say, Pilotwings Resort is a really nice looking game. Woohoo Island looks fantastic on the 3DS, and the whole game is just so bright and colourful. But again, this suffers from the same problem that Monkey Ball does. It just doesn't have enough content. In terms of critical response, Pilotwings Resort holds a 71 out of 100 on Metacritic, putting it in the mixed or average zone. There is also once again a perfectly matching user score of 7.1 out of 10. Pilotwings would go on to sell just under 1 million units worldwide, with the bulk of those sales coming from North America and Europe, most likely from people buying their 3DS at launch. I do think, however, with just more content and maybe even a multiplayer mode, this game could have reviewed a lot better and sold a lot more. If we do see the Pilotwings series return, perhaps as a launch title for a future Nintendo console, I hope Nintendo learn their lesson and just put more content in the game, because this just feels like a glorified tech demo that should have been included with the console. Now, before we move on to our next game, if you're a fan of 3DS content, game history, retro games, then this channel is perfect for you, so why not hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications. And anyway, let's get on with the video. Okay, so our next game is Combat of Giants Dinosaurs 3D. Now, the Combat or Battle of Giants, depending on where you're from, series was a staple on the Nintendo DS. Were they great? That's up to you. But of course it had to make a comeback on the 3DS. This game was a launch title in America and came out just a couple of days after the 3DS launched here in Europe. The game's plot sees 4 Guardians overlooking a peaceful dinosaur world until a cataclysmic event kills off those 4 Guardians, and an evil dinosaur called Archosaurus invades the land and takes over. It is up to 4 new dinosaur champions to stop him, of which you will be playing as. So the game features basically 4 different campaigns with 4 different classes of dinosaurs, where you can select a few different dinosaurs within each class. There's some customization options where you can change colours and stuff, and some rare skins which are found from collecting bones. You work your way through a level with a progress bar on your screen, and every now and then you're interrupted to have a fight. And at a quick glance, the fights in Combat of Giants Dinosaurs 3D actually looks alright. But after you've played this game for literally about 10 minutes, you've already played the entire game. In the level, you can control the dinosaur through a very fixed path using the circle pad. You can press Y to roar, and occasionally you can press A to do a little quick time event and break something in front of you, and that's it. When you're in the fight, you've got A and B, which are your 2 different attacks, and you can dodge left and right, and that's literally it as well. It's very bare bones. Get it? Whilst I appreciate the fairly in-depth customization system as well as a variety of dinosaurs to play as, pretty much once you've played as one, you've played as them all. The game features boss dinos as well, but to be honest with you, these boss dinos are just more of the same of what you do throughout the levels, just with a bigger health bar. There's nothing more particularly challenging about them, they just take slightly longer to beat. The Combat of Giants series is an interesting one to me because across the span of only 3 years, the series saw 8 different releases. Sure, some of these were different versions of pre-existing games, but 8 releases across 3 years has got to be quite a new low for Ubisoft. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you view this series, There was not another release after Combat of Giants Dinosaurs 3D. The series is pretty much in hibernation now. I'm unsure if this will ever return. I don't think anyone's really wanting it to be honest, otherwise I'm sure we would have seen something by now. Anyway, so in terms of critical response, this one holds the lowest score so far with a 44 out of 100 metascore, with critics citing it's very repetitive and doesn't make use of the new powerful hardware. Which, yeah, I can see that. The user score on this one, however, is just a little bit higher with a 5.4 out of 10, taking it from the generally unfavourable of the critic point of view to mixed or average for user score. As per VG charts, this game only sold about 300,000 copies, which isn't that much, really. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not great either. Anyway, let's move on to our next game. Okay, so next up we have Pro Evolution Soccer 2011 3D. Yeah, that one just rolls right off the tongue. PES 2011 3D was a launch title in every country, and was developed and published by Konami. And as the title would suggest, it is a soccer game, or as I'm from the UK, we call it football. Now, first off, I'm just going to say I'm not a fan of sports games at all. I could probably count on one hand the amount of FIFA, NBA, Madden games I've played in my entire life, so this was a fairly new experience for me because I just don't have the interest. However, I have to say, this game just merely existing and playing in the way that it does on the Nintendo 3DS is very impressive. For the time and the console it was on, the game looks fantastic, it runs fantastic, and honestly, it actually plays quite well. Unlike most of these games, the camera is actually behind the current player you are playing as, rather than being in that broadcast overview of the pitch. If you have the 3D on whilst playing like this, it can be quite nauseating, so I wouldn't really recommend doing that, but it's a pretty cool perspective to have compared to the standard view you'd get. As I said, I don't know very much about the sport, but there's a lot of content in this game to keep football fans very happy. There were over 200 clubs you could choose from in this game, with a variety of different difficulty ranges from beginner to top player. I'm going to be honest, even on beginner, I did not win a single game. I'm just not good at these kind of games. I'm not good at football in real life, I'm not good at it digitally. PES 2011 on the 3DS had some very specific features that the other versions of this game did not, including a Master League that made the most of Street Pass, so you could create your own team and raise the team through the ranks by competing against players you passed on the street. It had full match commentary in every game, which again for the time on the platform it's on is very impressive, and the audio quality of the commentary is actually not too bad either. There was also a wireless mode where you could play against a friend in a 1v1. What I'm trying to say is that this is a pretty impressive game. It's got plenty of content, it runs well. The only thing you can feel being a pain with the 3DS version is just slightly less control because you've just got the circle pad instead of a proper analog stick, and you're lacking 2 additional triggers that a normal standard controller would have. In terms of critical response, PES 2011 on the 3DS holds a 73 out of 100 metascore, with critics being impressed by the 3D effects, the new behind player view, and just the game running as well as it does on the console. The user score for this game is just a little bit lower with a 6.7 out of 10. Still not bad, just not as good as its critical score. The game would go on to sell just shy of 400,000 copies worldwide. Again, not fantastic, but pretty good. Anyway, on to our next game. Okay, so for our next game, let's change the pace from football to a puzzle game. So this is Bust a Move Universe, or here in Europe is known as Puzzle Bobble Universe. This was developed by Taito and Arika and was published by Square Enix. Puzzle Bobble is a spin-off series of the arcade classic Bubble Bobble and began in 1994 and has had many entries over the years. In terms of gameplay, you have to shoot or bounce bubbles that match the colours to burst them, pretty much. There are 2 main modes. There is Puzzle Mode, which is essentially the single-player story, which sees you having to rescue your friend from being captured, or there's Challenge Mode, which is just the same gameplay, but on a time limit. The single-player Puzzle Mode has boss battles, which is pretty cool, but overall there really isn't that much content in this game outside of just the standard match color puzzle gameplay that you already know. Puzzle Bobble Universe was the 15th game in this series at this point and did literally nothing to reinvent the formula, do anything new, or even add a decent amount of content. In fact, across the board, a lot of the issues with these 3DS launch titles is just a lack of content. The cartridge sizes for the 3DS are so much bigger than the DS ones, there's no excuse to not put more content in there, developers, come on. I don't really know. I don't have much to say about this game. It's just a puzzle game. It's fine. If you like that kind of thing, then great. But overall, it's just a puzzle game. Bubble Bobble, on the other hand, fantastic. Love those games. Anyway, in terms of critical response, Bust a Move or Puzzle Bobble Universe scored a 49 out of 100 Metascore, putting it in the generally unfavourable bracket. And again, the user score matches this perfectly with a 4.9 out of 10. With people just saying it's a fine game, but there's just no content here at all. And the 3D effects are just not very good. Most of the images and things that pop out at you in this game are just 2D JPEGs. There's no like 3D modeling or anything, so it's never going to look that great on a 3DS screen with the effect on. The game would sell 300,000 copies worldwide, with the bulk of that being sold here in Europe, with just a tiny bit in Japan and North America, so shout out to my UK and EU gang for buying most of these copies. I genuinely wish I had more to say about this game, but honestly, there's nothing more to it. It's just a cutesy looking puzzle game, and that's it. So with that, let's move on to our next game. Okay, so next up we have Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition. This was developed and published by Capcom and was a launch title for all countries. Street Fighter 4 is one of the best in the series, and it's just as good here on the 3DS as it was on every other platform. It runs nicely, it feels nice to control, you can use either the D-pad or the circle pad to control your characters, so you're not stuck just using the circle pad if you didn't want to. This is hardly a watered down experience, as this also features all of the 35 characters found in the home console version of Super Street Fighter 4. Each character has multiple different unique costumes, some of which were actually DLC in the home console versions that are now just included on the 3DS for no extra cost. If you had not guessed already, Street Fighter 4 is of course a fighting game. I didn't say that earlier because I kind of assumed it was obvious. Now, the 3DS version specifically has a number of new features that were not in the home console versions of the game, the most obvious of which being the 3D feature. That's always going to be exclusive to the 3DS. It supported the Nintendo Network, which meant you could play online, which a lot of games at launch did not have, so that's pretty cool. And once again, we have another half-baked Street Pass function. The Street Pass feature on the 3DS could have been used for so much more than just little throwaway things in different 3DS ports. But here you could use the Street Pass to swap in-game figurines of characters and basically just trade them. That's kind of it. So you have your standard modes here, you have your multiplayer mode, you have your arcade mode with different difficulties, so on and so forth. It's a standard, fantastic Street Fighter game. However, I do go back to the question I raised at the start. Why did the 3DS sell so poorly at the beginning, and was it because of these launch titles? Now, I have to say, Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition is fantastic, but it was a game that had already come out. It was just a port of a game to the 3DS. It's not one that would make people buy a whole console for it if you already owned the game. You can apply that same logic to Pro Evolution Soccer 2011 as well, because that game had already come out on multiple other platforms, so I can't see any football fans going out of their way to buy a 3DS specifically so they could play PES. There are a couple of other titles later in this video that fit that category as well. Now, in terms of critical response, this holds an 85 out of 100 Metascore, which is just very, very good. And the user score is also quite high with an 8 out of 10 overall. Now, Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition would actually sell pretty well as well, with 1.3 million units sold worldwide. Basically, this was a big success for Capcom, and was definitely one of the best-selling games in the early days of the 3DS. Okay, so next up I have some good news for the small fan base of submarines out there. That's right, our next game is Steel Diver. Steel Diver is the second of 3 first-party Nintendo titles on the console at launch. At least, it was in America. It did not release until May everywhere else in the world. So this was both published and developed by Nintendo with the assistance of Vitae on the development side. This is quite an interesting game for Nintendo to pull up with, to be honest with you, because I never expected them really to get into a submarine simulation genre, but here we are. Steel Diver actually began life back at E3 2004, as it was a playable tech demo for the DS before it had released. Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto had stated that the idea for this game had been there long before E3 2004, as well as his desire to make a flight sim, and I know Pilotwings is a thing, but he wanted a more in-depth, realistic flight sim. The tech demo at E3 had a good reaction, but Miyamoto wasn't able to expand on the idea until late into the DS's life due to scheduling conflicts. So, when a team was finally allocated to the project, the 3DS was already in development, so the game ended up being moved to the 3DS. Anyway, it's quite hard to pinpoint exactly how the gameplay works in Steel Diver and what kind of game it is. The genre is officially submarine simulator. So to control the submarine, it's all done via the touchscreen. You can adjust your height, your speed, your pitch, you fire your torpedoes from the touchscreen, and you can hide yourself away from incoming projectiles with a button on the touchscreen. So the core gameplay mode in Steel Diver is the campaign that's broken down into missions. The campaign story is set in an undisclosed year in the 1900s, where a power-hungry rogue nation has invaded many different countries. A secret organization known as the Steel Divers were formed from various countries' navies, and they're gonna fight the threat. You will face various threats such as very rough terrain and navigation, surface level boats dropping bombs down on you, and of course fellow enemy submarines. There is also a boss fight at the end. There is also a mode called Periscope Strike, which usually comes on at the end of a mission, which makes the most of the Nintendo 3DS's gyroscope feature. So you turn your 3DS console physically left and right to look around, and this would be the only time you'd really use any buttons because you could fire torpedoes using the B button. There was also a third mode called Steel Commander, which was the game's multiplayer mode. You and another friend could partake in a strategy game where you each command a fleet to try and destroy each other. This could be played with someone who did not own Steel Diver, as it made the use of download play. However, if you had no one who was willing to do this, you could just play against a computer. Steel Diver, whilst not a perfect game, is certainly an interesting release from Nintendo, and I'd like to see more different games from them like this. They did actually go on to produce a sequel called Steel Diver Subwars, but this would be free to play and sadly is no longer available due to the discontinuation of the online services on the 3DS. So the Steel Diver series has now been dormant for over 10 years, so it would be quite nice to see this make a comeback as a Switch eShop title or as a launch title on the Switch 2 perhaps, who knows. In terms of critical response, this holds a 58 out of 100 Metascore, with critics stating that this was a decent game with some good ideas and some really nice graphics, but it just didn't have enough content there. There aren't that many missions in the campaign, so it's quite quick to blast through. The user score is a 6.1 out of 10, so quite close to the Metascore as well. The game sold fairly decently with 500,000 copies sold worldwide. Obviously not the highs of some of Nintendo's bigger franchises, but I would say pretty humble beginnings. Just a shame we never really saw it go any further, I guess. Anyway, sticking with vehicles, let's pick up the speed a bit and move on to our next game. Okay, so next up we have our first racing game on the console, Asphalt 3D, developed by Gameloft and published by Konami in Japan and Ubisoft everywhere else in the world. This game was a launch title in Europe, North America and Australia and came out a couple of weeks after the 3DS's launch in Japan. As you've probably guessed from the title and the developer, this is an entry in the Asphalt mobile game series, which did originally start life on the Nintendo DS as well, and was the first time this had been on a Nintendo system for quite a while. This was a direct conversion of the mobile game Asphalt 6 Adrenaline. We have actually looked at this game before on the channel a couple of weeks back in my mobile games that got ported to the 3DS video. So once you've finished up here with this video, why not go check that one out as well? Anyway, Asphalt 6 has numerous issues with it, so let's just start out with something good. The car models look absolutely fantastic, both in 3D mode and regular mode. There's a nice variety of cars and bikes to use here, including some that you wouldn't typically find in most modern racing games now. However, you do also have your typical cars like Ferraris and Lamborghinis the later into the game you get. Now, the biggest issue with this game, well, the biggest two issues with this game, is both the handling of the cars and the physics. Everything feels clunky, and you best pray whenever the car jumps because you're gonna need it for when you land. The game has an XP based progression system, so the more events and races you complete, the more cars you unlock. There are 17 tracks based on real life locations, including San Francisco and Paris and places like that. None of them look particularly good, to be honest with you. They may have looked better on mobile, but here on the 3DS, genuinely they look like a game from a couple of generations back. There are some other modes here that include police chases, a game mode similar to Road Rage from Burnout where you have to just take out opponents. It's all pretty cool, but unfortunately every single one of these game modes just feels super half-baked. I know a lot of complaints with these 3DS launch titles is they don't have enough content, but the issue with this game isn't the lack of content, it's the lack of functioning content. There are far better racing games on the Nintendo 3DS, along with another racing launch title which we'll cover later in the video. So overall, in terms of critical response, this holds a quite low 43 out of 100 Metascore, with a user score of 5.2 out of 10. There are definitely much better Asphalt games in the series, so just go play one of those instead. Asphalt 3D would go on to sell just shy of 500,000 copies worldwide, with over half of these sales being from America. Anyway, let's move on to our next game. Okay, so for our next game we have Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell 3D, which is a launch title here in Europe. This was developed by Ubisoft as well as being published by them. In fact, there's quite a few Ubisoft published titles on the 3DS at launch, more than Nintendo had. Anyway, Splinter Cell 3D is essentially a demake of Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. I mean, it's a port, but it's just got slightly less content. Splinter Cell 3D is an action stealth game, primarily stealth should I say, where you get to play as the iconic Sam Fisher. I won't try and summarise the plot for you because it's actually quite a very complex political plot, which is cool for the kind of game it's in, but I couldn't summarise it for you without taking like 20 minutes. So anyway, let's talk the new control scheme for Splinter Cell. So obviously you don't have a traditional controller to play this on anymore, so you control Sam using the circle pad, and to look around using the camera you use the A, X, B and Y buttons, which at first was very confusing, but after a while you can get used to it. To equip any weapons or tools or interact with pretty much anything in the world, you use the touchscreen. And then when you do select the weapons, you still have to look around using A, X, B and Y, and you can shoot using the right bumper button. It all feels a bit clunky at first, but once you do get used to it, this makes for a pretty fun experience. Much like seeing Street Fighter 4 on the 3DS, it's just very impressive to have a game of this scope on the go. Yes, you're better off playing the original version or the HD remasters, but there is just something very cool about being able to play this on the go. So in terms of critical response, this one holds a 53 out of 100 Metascore, which is significantly lower than I thought it would be. Most of the reviews do tend to say that it's a remake that doesn't do justice to the original title, with some awkward controls, and other places saying that it just felt like a lazy port. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a lazy port, it's a technically impressive port. It's just not one that was really necessary, to be honest with you. This is one of two Tom Clancy games on the console at launch, so really, we didn't need both. It's certainly a unique game for the 3DS's launch lineup, and a unique title just across the 3DS's history. The user score for this game is a 5.7 out of 10, so just a little bit higher than its critical response, and the game went on to sell approximately 300,000 copies. Just for reference, the original game sold like 2.5 million, again that was across multiple consoles, but not very much in comparison. So let's move on to our next game.
EA Sports, it's in the game.
So our next game is the second and final sports game in the 3DS launch lineup, and that is Madden NFL Football. This was developed by EA North Carolina and was published by EA Sports, because what launch lineup of a console would be complete without an EA Sports title? Now I know I said I don't know very much about soccer, or as I would say football, but I know even less about NFL football. Not a clue. This is the first Madden game I've ever played, and to be honest, I kind of just made it up as I went along, and stuff just happened around me in the game that I assumed was fine. So earlier on in the video, I claimed that Pilotwings is essentially a glorified tech demo. Well, let me introduce you to Tech Demo 2 for the 3DS. Madden NFL Football is so lacking in content that this may as well have been a free tech demo on the console. The gameplay is fine, it works, the game looks nice, and for someone who doesn't know anything about the sport, I actually had fun playing this. However, the game lacks any proper career mode, it doesn't have multiplayer, it's literally just a single player, pick your team and play experience. There's very little here for what would have been a full-price game release. It features two modes of play, the traditional 11 on 11, but it also has a 5 on 5 mode, which was apparently in Madden NFL All Play on the Wii. This entry also has a feature called Game Flow, where the AI automatically selects the play depending on the situation, and you can also use this or you can just play the standard arcade version. There's also something called Spotlight Moment, where the game goes into slow motion whenever something important is happening, like dodging around a player to score a touchdown. It's all pretty cool. It's a technically sound and well-working game. There just truly is absolutely nothing here to make it worthwhile recommending over many other Madden titles. I found the 3DS controls to actually be pretty good. If EA had just put a bit more time and added some extra modes into this, this could have genuinely been one of the best launch titles on the console and one of the best sports games for the 3DS in general. In terms of critical response, once again this suffered a low critic score, almost entirely because there was basically nothing to do in this game. It holds a 49 out of 100 Metascore with a 5.1 user score to match. The game would go on to sell 400,000 copies, with pretty much all of those being in America, bar about 30,000 across the rest of the world. Anyway, let's move away from the sports genre onto something a little bit different. Okay, so our next game is the final first-party Nintendo release on the 3DS at launch, and that is Nintendogs Cats. This was developed and published by Nintendo and was a launch title for the console everywhere in the world. The original Nintendogs series of games were one of the best selling on the original DS console, with over 23 million units sold. So it's safe to say Nintendo were relying on Nintendogs Cats pretty hard to shift 3DS units in the early days. Now, structurally, this is a perfectly good game. The issue is, it just isn't that different to the original Nintendogs. It has cats, yeah, sure, but they hardly play any part in the game, to be honest with you. The main focus of the game is still on the dogs. There's some good improvements here, but nothing that's particularly worth buying a new entry for. For those of you who hadn't guessed already or didn't know, Nintendogs is a pet raising simulation game. You can interact using the DS or 3DS's microphone. Bob. Bob. And touchscreen. Back in 2005, this was absolutely revolutionary, but 6 years later with this entry, it's just kind of the same thing. Now, understandably, there's only so much innovation you can put into a real-life simulation topic such as raising a dog, but there was definitely something Nintendo could have done here, such as working dogs like Police Force, something like that, a little bit more dramatic than just having the puppy doing some disc throwing competitions and walking the same route. Now, there were some cool enhancements for this game, such as the use of the front-facing camera for the facial recognition, so your dog eventually will recognize your face and greet you, and if someone else comes onto your console and plays it, they might react negatively to a new face. The 3DS's microphone was better than the one on the DS, so the audio quality of what you're saying doesn't sound horrendous now. On top of the disc throwing and obedience trials, there's a new competition called lure coursing, so there is some new content here. And I will say, the world feels much more alive in this game than it did in the first. When you visit the shop, it's an actual shop you can see with a Mii running it rather than just a 2D JPEG in the background. There is a bit more effort and charm here, but it just isn't enough to justify making a whole new game. There were 3 different versions of Nintendogs Cats, and that was French Bulldog and New Friends, Golden Retriever and New Friends, and Toy Poodle and New Friends. Except in Japan, where the Golden Retriever version is called Shiba Inu and Friends. Nintendogs plus Cats gives me the impression that they built this entire game just improving on the original Nintendogs and suddenly thought, oh damn, we've made basically the same game, what can we do to add anything? And they thought, cats, that'll do. And it's just tagged on as this afterthought, really. Graphically, the animals look better in this game than they did in the previous. In fact, they look really good. The surroundings they're in look really good. The music is still charming. This is a charming game. It's just more of the same. Unlike the first game, I was already an adult when I played this, so I don't have the same nostalgia for Nintendogs plus Cats, but I can appreciate this is a very well-made game. In terms of critical response, Nintendogs plus Cats holds a 71 out of 100 Metascore, with most critics just saying it's a solid launch title, but it is just more of the same of the original Nintendogs. The user score is pretty close to that as well, with a 7.2 out of 10. Now, I mentioned earlier that Nintendogs on the original DS would go on to shift just shy of 24 million units. Well, to put that in comparison, Nintendogs plus Cats shifted 4.5 million units, which is significantly less. Don't get me wrong, this is still a really impressive number of games sold, but I don't think it's anywhere near as high as what Nintendo would have hoped. Now, I would like to see this series make a return at some point, but we'll see if that ever happens or not. I'm veering more towards probably not, to be honest. Anyway, let's move on to our next game. Okay, so picking up the pace a bit from Nintendogs, next up we have the other racing game for the 3DS at launch, Ridge Racer 3D. Oh man, I've been wanting to talk about this on the channel for a while. Ridge Racer 3D is a fast, loud, in-your-face arcade racer for the 3DS. It takes everything you know and love about the Ridge Racer series and puts it on a handheld console. And yes, I know there was Ridge Racer DS, but this is better. This was developed and published by Namco Bandai, and that's pretty obvious from the minute you start the first race because the first few AIs you overtake are all named after the ghosts from Pac-Man. Now, when I booted this game up, it asked me to put my name on my license and then take a picture for it as well using the front-facing camera of the 3DS. So there's now a psychotic picture of me on this game that appears pretty much anytime you complete a race or before you start one. Oh god, it was hard to take that seriously. The game has a variety of single-player modes, including a Grand Prix, a quick tour which allows you to select how long you want to play, and the game then generates a series of races based on the time you want to play for. You have your standard race, there's a one-make race, which means you select a track and race against 7 opponents, all using the same car. There's a time attack, and then Street Pass duel, which means you could race against the ghosts of other players acquired via Street Pass. I can't imagine much was made of this feature because I don't think this game sold particularly well, but as I've said before, it's always cool seeing weird Street Pass features in games. Now, graphically, this is a decent looking game. It's not the best looking racer on the console, but the car models all look good and the tracks look pretty decent as well. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to find at an arcade cabinet, which is really at Ridge Racer's core. The handling of the cars is fun, it's quick, slipstreaming is fun, drifting is easy to learn but harder to master. It has been simplified for this game, but still it can be difficult nonetheless. The game had a versus mode as well, which made use of the 3DS's local play, and you could pretty much play all of the modes except Grand Prix with a friend. The 3DS was home to a fair few racing games, but I have to say that Ridge Racer is certainly one of the best for the console. It was certainly the best of the two racing games at launch, and I would argue is one of the best launch titles for the console. It holds a pretty impressive 75 out of 100 Metascore, with a 7.3 out of 10 user score. It certainly wasn't the best selling game of the console, only shifting approximately 100,000 units, which I have to say is quite disappointing to learn because this is a very good game and you should definitely play this if you haven't already. The market value for this game since the 3DS has been discontinued hasn't really increased very much at all. In fact, you can pick up a PAL version of this game for about £5. So what I'm trying to say is, just play it please. The minute a Nintendo console gets a Mario Kart release, I feel like the other decent racers on the console do get overlooked. And honestly, fair enough, because Mario Kart 7 is a very good game, but Ridge Racer is good in its own right. Please check it out. I'm going to stop talking about Ridge Racer now, let's move on to another game. Okay, so next up we have another Ubisoft title, and that is Rayman 3D. Don't be mistaken, however, because this is actually a port of Rayman 2: The Great Escape, specifically a port of the Dreamcast version. Now, interestingly enough, this actually isn't the first time that Rayman 2 has been ported to a Nintendo console as a launch title, because Rayman DS was actually a launch title for the DS here in Europe, which was also a port of Rayman 2. I mean, this is a great game, don't get me wrong, but Ubisoft, do something with Rayman that isn't just porting his games onto newer titles. All they've really done with Rayman in the last few years is bring the newer games to the Switch, and just bring him out for a couple of crossovers like Brawlhalla and Mario and Rabbids. Come on, Ubisoft, do better. Anyway, back on topic. So yes, this was developed and published by Ubisoft. And if you've never played this game before, let me just quickly summarize it for you. Rayman 2, or Rayman 3D in this instance, is a 3D action-adventure platformer, which actually first released way back on the Nintendo 64, then Windows, then the Dreamcast, then getting a slight downgrade for the original PlayStation, before getting ported to the PS2. There's a Game Boy Color version, then of course the DS launch title. It's on iOS, and then finally on 3DS, and it hasn't been ported since then. Who knows, maybe we'll get Rayman 2: The Great Escape Nintendo Switch 2 edition or something ridiculous. The plot is essentially the world's core has been destroyed and weakens and disables Rayman's powers, which leads to him being captured aboard the Buccaneer by the Robo-Pirates. Eventually he gets some power restored, and you go off on this adventure to pretty much save the world, stop the pirates, so on and so forth. That is a super simplified version of this plot, because there's actually a lot of backstory and lore to Rayman, and I really just can't go into that in this video. Anyway, in terms of gameplay, Rayman is still a joy to control. Control and movement feels fluid, it's fun, combat works. That's about as much as I can say about that one. However, at the end of the day, this is a port of a very old game with pretty much no difference. As I mentioned, this is a port of the Dreamcast version, and the Dreamcast version did have some additional content, including some bonus minigames, but on the 3DS, those minigames have been removed. My personal experience with this game was with the PS2 version called Rayman Revolution, and I will stand by that being my favourite and the only one I would recommend playing. The 3DS version is fine, it just doesn't do anything different. The game also has some issues, most notably camera problems, and also some frame rate dips, which shouldn't be happening on a port of such an old game. There are multiple games from this era that have been ported to the 3DS, including Ocarina of Time, and that works way better than this. I mean, Ubisoft themselves were able to squeeze on Splinter Cell to this console, and that didn't suffer from frame rate problems. I don't know, it's certainly better than Rayman DS on the previous generation, but it's just a game that doesn't really need to exist, to be honest. And that makes me sad to say, because I love Rayman, and I think everyone should play his games, but just not like this. Overall, it's a fine functioning port of Rayman 2, it's just not the best way to play the game, and does nothing new to switch it up, except letting you play in 3D mode. In terms of critical response, Rayman 3D holds a 61 out of 100 Metascore, with critics pretty much saying what I've already said, it's just the same game but ported slightly worse. It holds a 6.7 user score out of 10, which is slightly higher than the critic score, which is nice to see, and would go on to sell pretty decently with just over 600,000 copies sold, with over half of those being here in Europe. Interestingly enough, Rayman 3D never actually saw a release in Japan, so it was a launch title for everywhere else in the world but never made it to Japan. Anyway, Ubisoft, please remember Rayman exists. Let's move on to our next game. Okay, so next up we have The Sims 3. This was developed and published by EA and released as a launch title here in Europe and in America. I'm sure you know what The Sims is by now, but it is a life sim where you control different people in this world, making sure to meet their every need and desire, or just wreaking pure chaos on their lives. It's up to you, really. Now, this is quite impressive for the 3DS. It has some features that were not in the main version of The Sims 3, such as being able to take a picture with the 3DS of your face and it being ported onto a sim. However, that doesn't really work very well. It wasn't very accurate, I'll say that. Of course, you've got the 3D effects, they're fine, they're nothing impressive, but they're there if you want to use them. But other than that, this is a very watered down experience compared to The Sims, either on console or the PC version especially. You can only have one save file per game, A lot of content from the console and PC versions are just not here. You're very limited on how many sims you can have and control, how many areas there are in the game. Pretty much everything is just watered down. And the other thing with the 3DS version is I don't remember the sims that you control in this game, at least on PC, being so naggy. Like, they always want something, and it's very hard to maintain that. Now, this is one of the few games on the 3DS, especially at launch, that utilizes purely touchscreen control. There is minimal control input from the buttons if you want to, but you can play this game entirely just with the stylus. I don't know, man. I'm not someone who was super into the Sims series anyway, so this port just doesn't do it for me whatsoever. There's nothing new on top of the original game outside of taking a photo of myself, and for a launch title with watered down content already, that just isn't good enough. It does feel like EA had good intentions with this. I mean, obviously they just wanted to make money, but it does feel like there was some effort put in. But it kind of just feels like they had a couple of decent ideas for a 3DS version and then just stopped there and didn't go any further with it. It's a shame because it could have been so much better. There was a cool Street Pass feature where you could swap sims with other players, which means sims you created could technically interact with other real-world players rather than just predetermined computers. I don't know, that's pretty cool. In terms of critical response, The Sims 3 on 3DS holds a 52 out of 100 on Metascore, putting it in the lower bracket of games at launch. Its user score, however, is significantly low with a 3 out of 10. This game was also ported to the DS, and that was much better than this, so I'm not quite sure where this went wrong. The game would go on to sell roughly 700,000 copies, which is pretty good going, but I just can't recommend this at all. There are better versions of The Sims 3 floating about out there, and I would recommend you play those over this. Let's move on. So next up we have Professor Layton and the Miracle Mask. Interestingly enough, this game was actually only a launch title in Japan, with this game not coming to the rest of the world until October of 2012, well over a year later. This was developed by Level 5 and was published by Level 5 in Japan and published by Nintendo for the rest of the world. Professor Layton and the Miracle Mask is a cross between a point-and-click adventure and a logic puzzle game. It has a mix between beautifully animated 2D cutscenes and then in-game 3D ones as well. The game sees the titular Professor Layton alongside his apprentice Luke and assistant Emmy travelling to the city of Montador to stop the Masked Gentleman, who is seemingly terrorizing this city with the use of dark magic. So I'm just going to come out and say it, I'm not very clever when it comes to puzzle games. In fact, I'm absolutely useless. So from the get-go, Professor Layton is not a series meant for me, and this is why I've barely played them. I appreciate they're very well-made games, with very interesting story and pretty decent voice acting, but I just can't get my head around it. However, I'm not going to let my stupidity get in the way of what is a good game. And across its time, the Professor Layton series has sold nearly 20 million units, so this is definitely a well-beloved franchise. There are many puzzles here and interactive set pieces, and it makes for a really fun time. It's just a shame that this didn't launch with the 3DS outside of Japan, because I feel like this would have been a pretty strong contender for one of the best games on the system at launch. Unfortunately, there seems to pretty much always be a huge gap between the game releasing in Japan and it getting localized for the rest of the world. Usually anywhere between about a year to 2 years to sometimes even more. Anyway, yes, Professor Layton and the Miracle Mask is a very good game. It holds an 82 out of 100 on Metacritic, along with an 8 out of 10 user score. The Miracle Mask was slap bang in the middle of the prequel trilogy to the Professor Layton series, which I didn't even know was a thing. You had the original trilogy that all released on DS, and then the prequel trilogy which released between the DS and 3DS. The 3DS was also home to the crossover between Professor Layton and Phoenix Wright, which is cool. And the series has been kind of dormant for a few years, but there is a new release expected this year called Professor Layton and the New World of Steam. The Miracle Mask would go on to sell just shy of 1.5 million units, which is pretty good going. And overall, if you're into puzzle games, you definitely have to check this game and the series as a whole out, because it's a really good time. Anyway, let's move on to a galaxy far, far away. Okay, so next up we have LEGO Star Wars 3 The Clone Wars. This was a launch title here in Europe and North America, but again never saw a Japanese release. This was developed by TT Fusion and was published by LucasArts. LEGO Star Wars 3 is set during the Clone Wars animated series, and partly Attack of the Clones as well. So in terms of gameplay, this is literally any LEGO Traveller's Tales game that's ever been made, but on portable. The DS had a bit of a rough time with TT LEGO game ports, but I'm happy to say that LEGO Star Wars on the 3DS has come across quite nicely. It's still a bit dumbed down from the home console version, because of course it was going to be, but this is a pretty impressive port. It plays well, it's quite a lot of fun, it's just quite easy. The 3DS version of the game featured 77 playable characters, and some exclusive mini-games that were only in handheld ports of the game. It has all the standard LEGO platforming, combat, and very mild puzzle solving that you've come to know and love from a Traveller's Tale LEGO release. Out of the 3 original LEGO Star Wars games, this is the one I have the least nostalgia for, because the only time I played this was when it was on Games with Gold on Xbox 360, which was a good few years after the game had already come out. It's a pretty good time nonetheless, and if you wanted to play LEGO Star Wars 3 on the go, the 3DS version out of the 3 handheld ports is definitely the best of the 3. However, outside of that, unless you really like the additional minigames, there isn't really anything here to recommend over just playing it on your Xbox or PlayStation. So the 3DS version of this game holds a 67 out of 100 Metascore. Not terrible, not great, it's just kinda there. The user score is actually a little bit lower with a 6.3 out of 10. I feel like if you played this on launch you'd have nostalgia for it, but if you've gone into it since then, yeah, not so great. The game would go on to sell very well because it's a LEGO Star Wars game, of course it was going to, but the 3DS version specifically sold just over 1.1 million copies, making it one of the better selling launch day titles. There isn't very much I can add to the conversation about LEGO Star Wars 3 or just the LEGO Star Wars franchise in general. It's been covered to death, there's not really anything to add about it. It's a game that came out, it was alright, moving on. Okay, so next up we have Samurai Warriors Chronicles, developed by Omega Force and published by Tecmo Koei. I've probably butchered that pronunciation. If you haven't heard of it before, the Warriors franchise is a series of hack-and-slash games, and this was the first release in the series for the 3DS, obviously because it's a launch title. The game follows you picking your own samurai, having a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon style quiz at the start to determine your characteristics, and then you just pave your way to carve out your own samurai legacy. So in terms of gameplay, you fight your way across big open battlefields, clearing troops upon troops, and then boss captains and stuff like that. It all feels very satisfying, it's all very fun. Samurai Warriors Chronicles is not the best looking game in the series, and is not the best looking entry on the 3DS, however it plays very well, and that makes up for it. Whilst you're out on the battlefield, a variety of objectives will pop up, like stop this enemy from fleeing with intel, stuff like that. There's bonus objectives for completing it within a certain time limit, or you can swap to one of your side characters and there's a bonus for completing it as them or your main character. The bottom screen shows a map of the battlefield and shows where your allies are, and you can actually give them instructions on where to head to and fight next. This is primarily a hack and slash game, but there is a lot of strategy in the background as well. Depending on whether you chose male or female will depend on what weapons you have. Male has a katana and then a rifle that you can blast off with, and the female has dual swords, but either way, you do a lot of damage. Combat is satisfying, it is very satisfying to just slash your way through hordes upon hordes of enemies. There are special moves which all look very cool, they all do a lot of damage. Overall, this is a fun game. I haven't had much experience with the Warriors series outside of Fire Emblem Warriors, so I've been very impressed with what I've played. Chronicles would go on to get 2 separate sequels as well, the first of which only being released in Japan, but the second sequel, called Samurai Warriors Chronicles 3, had a release everywhere else. Which makes like no sense to me. If you're going to localize the third game but not the second, why bother? Anyway, the game holds a 61 out of 100 Metascore, with people just saying it's a pretty decent title, not the best looking game, but it's nothing that we haven't seen before. The user score, however, is a little bit higher with a nice 7.5 out of 10. Samurai Warriors Chronicles would go on to sell just over 250,000 units, which is pretty good going. As a launch title, this is definitely up there with the better games in the selection, I can't say I'd recommend this Warriors title over other ones, but it's a pretty good time. Okay, so last but not least, we have Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Shadow Wars, the last of the launch titles for the 3DS. This was a launch title everywhere in the world except Japan, where it launched on 19th of May the same year, 2011. It was developed by Ubisoft and published by Ubisoft as well, and is of course in the Tom Clancy series, and is the second Tom Clancy game to release at launch for the console. However, instead of just being a port of something else, thankfully this is a new game, and it's a turn-based tactical RPG. And I'll tell you what, it's a lot of fun. There are 6 different classes that you control, all with their own individual character arcs and names, but to summarise, you have the Commando, the Sniper, the Gunner, the Medic, the Recon, and the Engineer. And unlike most games in this list, this game is filled with content. There are 37 single-player campaign missions, which takes up to around 35 to 45 hours depending on the difficulty level. There are also 20 additional skirmish missions that are standalone with fixed teams and deployments. And there are also 10 multiplayer missions which for some reason are played on a single 3DS console. You just hand the console to your buddy. That's a bit of a weird choice. The battle system in this game is pretty similar to something such as Advance Wars or Fire Emblem, but elevation and cover play a tactical role in how you approach the game. There is also a support fire system, so there is some standout things here that make it different to other turn-based RPGs that have graced Nintendo handhelds before. Ubisoft were really going for it at the 3DS's launch because they had 5 different published titles under their banner. Both Tom Clancy games, Rayman, Combat of Giants, as well as publishing Asphalt 3D. Whilst not all their efforts were, great, this is a standout for sure. I also just find it interesting that Ubisoft had more published games on the 3DS than Nintendo did at launch. In terms of graphics, the game looks pretty good. It's nothing to write home about, but it looks pretty cool. The combat is satisfying, it's fun, the tactics are fun and challenging when they need to be. There's some nice cutscenes in between that are both a mix of 2D and 3D animation. The dialogue between characters, whilst a little clunky and cheesy at times, is still pretty decent, and there's a fairly good plot to follow along to as well. It's everything you'd expect from a good Tom Clancy game, and I'm glad they stuck the landing with this one. If you haven't really played many tactical RPGs before, I would certainly recommend giving this a go. Or if you're a fan of Tom Clancy games, again, check this one out, it's worth playing. So in terms of critical response, this holds a 77 out of 100 on Metacritic with a 7.9 user score, with a lot of people today considering this to be one of the hidden gems of the 3DS. And fair enough, the game went on to sell about 300,000 copies, so it wasn't the biggest hit, but it didn't sell too badly either. And with that, that takes us to the end of our look at all the launch titles for the Nintendo 3DS. Now, having played through these games, it's quite clear to see why this was a factor in the 3DS's poor sales at the beginning. Not only was the price too high for the console, but you had a very weird mix of games. Nintendo themselves had a very poor showing in terms of first-party releases, with their biggest hit being Nintendogs. And then on top of this, a lot of the games on the console were just ports of pre-existing games. You have Rayman, The Sims, Pez, Street Fighter, Splinter Cell. Quite a good few of the titles at launch were just ports of previous games. And then on top of this, some of these games were just so lacking in content that they weren't worth getting the console for at launch anyway. I don't know, there's certainly some very interesting pieces of 3DS history to be found here, and some cool games to be honest with you. Anyway, please let me know in the comments down below if you have a favourite out of these launch titles, or if you were someone that got the 3DS on launch, which of these games did you get with it? If you'd like to see any of these games have their own focused video as well, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications of my future uploads. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.